Welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast, now part of the Work Defined Podcast Network. Join us as we explore the vital role of compensation, strategy, data, and people analytics in navigating today's complex business world. With the resources of Work Defined, we're now bringing you deeper insights and actionable ideas from top experts. Now, here is your host, David Turetsky. Hello and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I'm your host, David Turetsky, and as we always try and do, we always try and find the best and brightest, not only across HR, but outside. But today, we are talking to the best and the brightest, and his name is Schon Parris. Schon, how are you?
David, it is so good to see you, as always. The pleasure is all mine.
Oh, no, I must take some of that pleasure, because you are undoubtedly one of my best friends, and it's so cool to talk to you. Every time I talk to you, I learn something, and this is just going to be another opportunity.
Oh, well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. No, so let's talk, Schon. Tell people.
Let's do it.
Let's tell people a little bit about Schon Parris.
I will. I live in beautiful Alpharetta, Georgia, just north of Atlanta, for those of you that don't know. I currently work at ADP. I've been here for 26 glorious years.
So they got you out of high school.
That's right. Absolutely. Straight from high school to here. Over that long of a time, I've done so many different things, but the last 8, 9, 10 years or so have been focused on this incredible data set that we have here at ADP, helping organizations use that data, use analytics, really just to make better decisions. Absolutely love it. Love what I do. I feel very fortunate to be where I am.
We're fortunate to have you here. But as we do on every episode of the HR Data Labs podcast, we ask our guests, what's one fun thing that no one knows about Schon Parris?
One fun thing. Well, I like to say this because it is fun. I play in a rock band here in Atlanta. It's true. I'm a bass player. I sing a little bit. I have been playing music ever since I was in high school. I used to play guitar, and in high school, I was the worst guitar player. So I had to pick up the bass and learn how to play that, which I was happy to do. And I've fallen in love with that instrument. And it's one of the coolest things to be able to get together with other musicians and just have a blast on the weekends. Absolutely love it.
So can we see you guys on YouTube, or are you strictly a club and now stadium?
My last band is out on YouTube. Our name was Onus Band, and you can find our videos out there. But my current band right now is we're just getting our sea legs up under us. It's a new group of musicians I'm playing with, so we're getting some stuff booked for this coming summer.
All right, so we'll put links to the videotapes.
That's okay. You don't have to do that.
No, we want to. I'm not going to be embarrassing anybody. Schon Parris is akin to Geddy Lee when it comes to bass playing, so I'm sure.
Hey.
But today we're going to be rock stars, or at least we're talking to a rock star in the world of HR data. And today's topic is very near and dear to the listeners of the HR Data Labs podcast. We're going to be talking about helping HR leaders quantify through data analytics the material value of their workforce, translating HR metrics into business and financial outcomes.
It is very cool.
Hey, it's Libby DeLucian. If you're sick of business advice that sounds cute, but doesn't actually move the needle forward, this one's for you. The Libby DeLucian podcast is where we go one layer deep. No gurus, no glitter, just straight up unfiltered talk about scaling a business, running a household, and holding on to your sanity in the middle of the chaos. If you're the bottleneck in your business or in your own life, I'll show you how to fix it. Simple, tactical, and one layer deep every time. Let's go. Visit libbyd.com and check out our podcast today.
So, Schon, The first question we have for you is, with the cost of the workforce being the largest expense item for most organizations, HR leaders actually do struggle to quantify in financial terms the impact of their human capital, quote unquote.
Yep.
Is there a gap here, and what's going on with this?
There is a gap here. I mentioned earlier that I've been at ADP for 26 years or so now. And during that time, I've worked hand in hand with HR leaders years over years, over decades, over decades. And one thing I can tell you is that HR leaders have stories. They've got so many great stories they're proud of, maybe stories they're not proud of, but all kinds of stories galore. We improved our employee engagement by 15 points. We reduced attrition by 10 points. Awesome stories and things that we intuitively know are good for business, no doubt about it. However, when it comes to quantifying the impact of those HR performance areas into business outcomes and financial outcomes, that's really where the gap is that I see. Actually, being able to show the materiality of what's happening in the HR space, we're really focused on things like performance and behavior, and translating that into things like customer satisfaction and quality and scrap reduction. Pick your KPI, pick your industry, and ultimately profitability. Being able to stitch all of those things together to tell like a true, like to show the ROI of your human capital is something that many struggle with.
Well, I have two thoughts when you say this. Is it an acumen issue? Is it a training issue? Do they just not have the skills? Or is it that they've tried, but finance looks at it and laughs at it and says, those are soft issues. Those aren't hard dollars. We can't draw a line there. Or that correlation is more, it's not causation, it's correlation.
Yeah. I'd pick a mix of those actually, in that I think it's partly acumen. Human resource leaders came up in the HR space oftentimes and just aren't as comfortable with the hard financial side and showing hard business cases. It's not to say they can't, not to say they couldn't learn. It's just not something they've traditionally had to do. And I don't think it's something that a lot of the businesses that they work for have insisted upon in the
Sure.
past. I think that is something that we are seeing changing now as the financial functions and the HR functions and the IT functions come closer and closer together. I think that, well, I feel pretty strongly that's incumbent upon HR leaders to bridge this gap, to get very good at showing the ROI for things that are happening with the workforce. And I think especially in the dawn of AI, it becomes even more imperative because people are going to be looking for headcount. And if you can't articulate the materiality of that workforce and show those hard ROI returns of how your people are driving profitability, it's going to be very, very tempting for those in the financial world to not look at that headcount and start looking for ways to cut costs.
So you think that the HR teams need to be able to align themselves better with either better skills or better tools in order to be able to make these or have these conversations and be able to make these material statements that say, this is the state of our HR, our human capital workforce, or our workforce, and this is how we're either improving them or how we're growing or how they can actually provide value.
I do, but it's not to say that they're going to have to go about this alone. I mean, it's most definitely going to require a partnership with operations and with finance. I mean, the way that we're going to overcome this gap is we need to ultimately turn performance with the workforce into metrics, something we can sink our teeth into, something we can get our hands on. But from there, being able to tie those metrics into metrics that exist today around the business. What does our client satisfaction look like? And then ultimately metrics that exist today when it comes to financials. What does our revenue look like? What does our profitability look like? So we can turn HR performance into metrics and we can start to stitch the HR metrics together with the business metrics, together with the financial metrics. That's really going to set HR leaders up in a more favorable way to be able to tell this story of how what's happening in the HR space is impacting what's happening in the business space and driving what's happening in the financial space. But it is absolutely going to be a collaboration across all of those functions. And
Sure.
I'll give you an example. Take turnover, one of the common painful issues that HR leaders are asked to get their arms around. Understanding what the negative impact of turnover in the business is something that absolutely requires a collaboration between operational leaders and HR leaders. What
Hmm.
is the productivity loss when somebody walks out that door? What does that look like? How long does it take to get somebody else up to speed? How are our customers suffering
Right.
during this transition? How is our production suffering
Right.
during this transition. So absolutely, they're going to have to walk hand in hand down this road. But once you can get these things identified and quantified and put really in a visualization, so the
Yep.
relationships are obvious to all of the stakeholders, that's going to help HR leaders be able to tell this story.
What's fascinating about what you just said, though, is that we live in a world, especially in the US, where 2/3 of the workforce is on an hourly basis. And a lot of these productivity measures are pretty obvious. Usually they're time based or they're widget based. And especially for things like hospitality,
Mhm.
if we take something like a housekeeper or say a retail sales, there are really easy performance metrics you can get out of that. Like you were mentioning client satisfaction or
Mhm.
employee satisfaction as being good measurements of what happens, especially when there's loss of employment. And so you would imagine because of that makeup of the workforce, we'd be able to do a lot better job of actually developing those stories around that data because there should be ubiquitous data. We capture
Yeah.
everything about their hours
Yeah.
and we capture a lot of things about their outcomes. So don't you think that this is maybe it 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 should be more obvious than it is, or am I
Yeah.
missing something there?
No, you're not. I mean, you're really hitting the nail on the head,
I
in
was
my
hitting the head
opinion.
many times, actually.
You were hitting the head with a nail many times. We have, as HR leaders, we have access to an incredible array of data. I mean, data
Yeah,
that can be taken from payroll platforms and HRS platforms and learning and training and time. And we are surrounded by all of these data points, which can easily be turned into metrics.
mhm,
But I just don't think that the demand has really
mm,
existed in the past to do what we're talking about today, which is okay, now let's roll up our sleeves and let's really quantify how all this
mm,
investment in the workforce that we've made is actually driving business outcomes. Like
results, yeah,
I think leaders understand that to reduce turnover is a good thing. I mean, I think
mhm,
everybody understands that. And certainly, the less turnover we have, the more institutional knowledge we retain, the happier our clients are going to
right,
be, the more profitability will exist. Like everybody understands that. But when it comes to an HR leader needing to seek an investment for something to drive, let's say, engagement or have even a greater impact on retaining employees,
right,
they're not they're not going to be able to walk down the hall and say, trust me, dude, if you
right,
drop $2 million into this new training platform, it's going to do really great things for the organization and expect to get any
right,
kind of funding
right,
based on that. In fact, you might get the opposite. You might get thrown out. Or even worse, they said, I'm glad you came down the hall because I was actually thinking we need to cut some headcount around here. So you saved me a trip, right? That's not going to go the way that you hope it will. So
right,
I think that with organizations greater dependence upon metrics, there's certainly a larger focus on being data driven organizations. I
right,
think study after study after study confirm what we already know, which is data driven organizations outperform those that are still very early in their development path. All of these things come together, and even with AI making this easier, it's the impact in the analytics space is making it
right,
so much easier now. The metrics are available, the analytics are available. You've got so many organizations that are providing like out of the box analytics capabilities.
right,
It's easier now than having some 37 tabbed Excel spreadsheet with VLOOKUPs and pivot tables linking things all over the place. You scratch your head, you get lost at data like that. So it's
Well,
much
and
more
one bad
accessible
cell
now.
can screw
Yeah.
up the entire workbook too.
Oh my gosh. I've been in I've spoken with organizations before where their entire operations is run in Excel, and you hear these horror stories about, well, somebody deleted the spreadsheet
Right,
and you got all years worth of history that's gone, or all of our client data is gone. That's just
right,
neither here nor there. The point that I'm trying to make is that the tools now exist to make this
right.
easier, I think, than it's ever been before, for HR leaders to do exactly this, which is quantify how the workforce is driving solid business outcomes and ultimately financial outcomes.
But if we, and I think you mentioned this before, let's go to question two, because I think question two really kind of spells out the problem from a other groups of the organization perspective. HR still struggles with telling these stories with data. But if you look at other parts of the organization, like sales and operations, they have a
Mhm.
really good foundation and they have a very good understanding about the financials and the impact that their decisions are or make on them. Why not HR? Why not?
Why not? That's a great question. Look, when it comes to other areas of the business, certainly, like if you think about operations, I mean, for decades they've been able to show like how what's happening within operations, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's in
Right.
the restaurant industry, hospitality, financial, you can go up and down the list. Like they can clearly show how what's happening in their space is driving financial outcomes.
Of
But when
course.
you look in the HR space, it's just something that not the case with larger organizations. I think they've cracked this nut when you're talking about 10,000 employees and above. They've had to be able to draw these correlations before. But as you start to get smaller and smaller in organizations, I don't even mean really small, but even like 5,000 employees and such, it's still very much an area of opportunity. It's still something that I think we've got work to do in being able to show the relationship between how attrition impacts client sat, impacts
Hmm.
profitability, to show how engagement impacts
Right.
scrap reduction, like to stitch those pieces of the thread together to show the correlations between each one of those pillars.
Yeah, like training and loss or training and incidents. Those are
Right.
you think that they should be obvious, but what's the first line item that gets cut when we're having a bad period? We cut training or we cut other. I mean, obviously you can't cut training that's required based on certifications and things because you don't want to be
Yeah.
afoul of any regulations if the regulations are still there. But many organizations, to your point, they struggle with being able to try and call either create a causal or a correlative effect of these trainings on profitability. It's just weird.
I think if you think about like the operations function, I think they have just are used to putting together business cases for change,
Hmm.
showing the
Sure.
ROI of a new piece of equipment that's going to drive efficiencies. Like it's part of the mind share. It's like if we want to invest in this, we need to show how it's going to drive
Right.
performance, you know, how we're going to gain in efficiencies. That idea just doesn't seem to persist as much in the HR space. And that's exactly what we're talking
Mm.
about. We need to get there. We need to
Yeah.
get there. And I think there's some steps that HR leaders might think of as they get better in this area. I mean, we want their projects to be funded. Like I believe very firmly like that employees, like they're not an expense, like they're potential drivers of revenue,
Right.
potential waiting to do great things for the business. But we have to show how. And it's up to the HR leaders to show how they're going to do that. So, I'd recommend maybe starting small, identifying a problem, and we could just take turnover as the obvious one because it affects everyone. So you identify a problem like turnover, and then what you want to do is you want to assess the cost of doing nothing. What happens if we
Right.
continue
It's
with
a
our
control.
current 20% turnover rate?
Right.
What does that look like? And that's when you start to talk to your business partners, those in operations, those in finance. What happens when we continue turning 20% of our employees over every quarter or every year? What does that look like? What are our recruiting costs? What does severance look like? What is the training cost of that? What does loss of productivity look like? Those are numbers, and they're numbers that an leader needs to collect from the business to assess if we just keep running as we are now, what does that cost, right?
Right.
But then, if you're contemplating bringing in a new program, let's say a new onboarding program, which you expect is going to have a positive impact on new hire turnover, let's say like
Right.
that, you need to do exactly what your other areas of the business have been doing for years, which
Well,
is do a cost benefit analysis, right? So we expect for this new tool, this new program, to reduce turnover by 10% over the next year. And based on the numbers that you received from your operational partners in finance and business, what is that 10% reduction in turnover? What are the savings going to look like? What are the savings in productivity and the training and the severance and the other
right.
things that we talked about? So now you have a line by line comparison of the cost of doing nothing versus
Right.
the cost of doing something. You can
Right.
quantify those things. And now instead of going down into the CFO's office and begging for funding, you're giving them a choice. Here's
Right.
what's going to happen if we do nothing. Here's what's going to happen if we do something. And I know
Right.
it sounds so obvious. It's just not something that not everybody, but many, many HR leaders just struggle with being able to put together those business cases.
And it's that business case that they struggle with because a lot of times they look at some of this stuff and they think it's more ephemeral, but it really isn't. Putting together that onboarding plan that you're talking about, it will not only save money, it'll drive deeper or drive more employee engagement, potentially managerial engagement as well if you're designing it correctly. So, let me go to question 3 though, Sean, which is, what does great look like though? I mean, you're talking about a minimum of being able to set up a business case for this stuff. And, we
Mhm.
really do expect organizations to do this really well. What does it mean to do it well?
This is where I think advanced analytic capabilities are very helpful. I'll just say visualizations. And I think visualizations are a great way to, especially for an HR leader who may be less comfortable in the financial space, visualizations allow them to tell the stories which they're so good at, but in a way that a financial leader can easily see the value. So, by visualizations, by using advanced analytics to be able to plot, right, correlations between declining turnover, improving client satisfaction, reduced scrap, again, pick your
Right.
KPI, and then quarters later down the line, improved revenue, visualizing all of those things out together in one place so you can clearly see the correlation, the
Right.
impact of doing this, how that drives that, how this drives this. That's going to stitch all of this together for an HR leader who's very comfortable telling stories, but that's going to help them tell stories in a metric driven way, which is going to resonate to the finance leader. So, in
Absolutely.
my mind, analytics aids in storytelling for an HR leader to tie these different areas of the business together in a meaningful way that's going to show that yes, indeed, what we're investing in our workforce is going to drive profitability ultimately as long as we do it right
Well, it's
versus
also, yeah.
being just this enormous like expense on the balance sheet. They're much more than that.
Well, it's also going to give you a thing or a methodology for tracking how we're
Mm,
doing, right? Did the investments that we make drive the outcomes that we were hoping to achieve? Were there other reasons why that it either failed or it succeeded? And it's measurable. So I love where you're going with this because we've been telling people metrics for a very long time, but
yeah.
tying it to something specific and then being able to show it and then prove it out, really, really impactful.
I'm so glad you said that. Organizations do track things like revenue per employee or
Hmm.
profitability per employee, and those are metrics that are used to track change over time. Like you might look
Sure.
at that one quarter versus another quarter or annually, but those numbers contain so many details that it's really hard to see what's going on between. If you look at how revenue per employee per employee change from one year to the next.
Right.
Okay, it looks better, but what about all of the expense that's in there? That really doesn't jump out in there. Or, there's so many things that can happen in the workforce: client churn and employee
Hmm.
churn, and rising and changing the way that your organization is structured, and manager flux, and all of these things
Right.
that are embedded in those very high level metrics. What you just mentioned is where we need to be, because now you can plot out the details that are underlying some high level revenue per employee metric. Well, let's take that down a level. Let's take that down 7 levels, and let's look by manager
Hmm.
how turnover is impacting business outcomes, by job title how turnover is impacting business outcomes. Because when you can look at things at that level, that positions an HR leader in a great spot, because they're pulling these signals from the workforce ongoing, not
Yeah.
waiting until the end of the quarter when it's too late to do anything
Right.
about it,
Exactly.
but ongoing, so you can make changes before it's too late, right? That's
Yeah.
really what it's all about. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah. And what I would do if it were me, I'd also put the context of the macroeconomy into it as well, to be
Mm,
able to say, well, we did this stuff, we put all the onboarding stuff in, it was great, but we had a recession. So it didn't work
yeah.
out. It wasn't because we didn't invest, and it wasn't because we invested. It was because there was a recession. So let's hang on to this for a while. Let's keep it impending until we can get out of this recession. And that's the other problem, is blaming things or using things as a well, look, we invested in this and we said this was causal. We know there are other reasons. But as we grow as leaders and as we grow as metric leaders, we're able to tell stories that can tell it well or tell it better, because we don't want to be that person that stands up on stage and says, yeah, we saved 20% because of this impact onboarding tool that we built, and then realize that it actually had nothing to do with it later on. And we would have made more money had we not done it. You don't want to be that person, because that's an
Yeah.
easy pink slip right there.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought in, bringing in external data as well. I mean, I think having external benchmarks so that you can compare yourself to how others are doing, whether it's in your sector, your industry,
Right.
the geographies that you're operating in, because it very well may be that, you look at your own metrics and you may not feel great about, let's say, a turnover level running at 20%.
Hmm.
But when you look across the industry, you see that you're best in class. That provides some perspective for you, you know.
Right.
So
Exactly.
having, or worst in class, on the other side of
Right.
that. I mean, you need that external context to really get the complete picture of how you're doing as an organization. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, well, context is incredibly important, especially when you're trying to sell this and your leaders look at you and go, "So what do our competitors do?" And you say, "I don't know." That's going to be an early exit for you. That's
Yeah,
a career
that's not
limiting
gonna
move.
feel good.
No,
Yeah.
it's not. So
Yep.
so Sean, this has been fascinating, a great discussion, and I think what a lot of people are now thinking about is trying to plot out their business strategy in HR by saying, what's next? Will I be able to measure? What am I going to be able to create that business plan on? Any advice for them to get started?
Well, we've talked about storytelling
Hmm.
from the very first sentence that we mentioned.
Yeah.
And I think that storytelling is so valuable. And it occurs to me as our conversation evolved that we as HR leaders want to lean into what we do best, and that is tell great stories about how
Hmm.
the workforce is driving success, right?
Sure.
So, what we're talking about is telling great stories. Yes, we're not going to lose that. We want to lean into it because we're great at it. But those stories are now going to be backed up by solid, quantifiable metrics. Stories that we can take our great stories and walk down the hall to the CFO and say, yes, the investment in that new engagement program reduced turnover, and we all feel really good about it. But let me show you what that did for our client satisfaction in
Right.
quarters 2 and 3. And by the way, look at what happened to our profitability in quarter 4. So what I would say is, like, there is no quick fix. Like, I think that goes without saying. This is not a
Sure.
6-month thing. This is a 12, 18, 24 forever month thing where we're tracking our progress over time, because that's really the only way over time are you going to be able to stitch together things you do in this quarter from a workforce standpoint.
Sure.
It's going to take 2, maybe 3 quarters for those to begin to filter through
Absolutely.
into the operational side of the business and ultimately into the financial side of the business. So we want
Oh,
to
yeah.
keep that great storytelling acumen, which we've always had. And now we just want to bring in those visualizations. So our great stories are backed up by incredible, defensible metrics and analytics.
And by the way, what you mentioned is I totally agree with you, but you also have to go through business cycles to be able to see it work
Yeah.
out. So that
Yeah.
all just makes total sense. I am, again, shocked at how much I learn from you every time I talk, because
It's all in the
I know you,
questions, sir. It's all in
I
the
just know you as
questions.
a nice guy, but now I know you as a brilliant guy. Well, I already said I know you as a brilliant guy.
I don't deserve your kindness. You know this.
Yes, you do. Sean, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, David. Always appreciate it.
And thank you all for listening. Take care and stay safe. Thank you for listening to the HR Data Labs podcast. Don't forget to hit subscribe and share it with your network. You can also check out the recordings on Spotify or the HR channel, now on Roku and Fire TV. Thank you, take care, and stay safe.